Good afternoon, everybody. A little bit tardy on getting this video up. Apologies for not having videos of me so far. I've had some technical difficulties getting things posted and replaced inside a course that's already kind of been established and is up. So apologies. In any case, here I am, and we're going to try to move forward and have this little conversation every week. So this week, looking at cultural difference and citizenship and intersectionality and diaspora. And so the lecture, I feel like, does a pretty solid job of orienting you to those concepts and how they operate in our world, but typically in an online class. Those of you who have been in online classes with me before will know this. Try to offer up a video to just maybe contextualize things a little bit and give you a couple of really concrete examples so that as you sort of take in the information and then apply it to the world that you're living in when looking at, for example, your social media feed or something of this nature, you'll have perhaps you'll feel like, oh, I can see that, or I see this, or it'll be more visible to you in the world that you're walking in, which is always kind of the aim, right, with knowledge. So thinking about identity and how it marks people and the category of difference, and this idea of taking an intersectional approach so that we are attempting to have some consciousness about the ways in which various aspects of identity and power and the various and sundry factors that influence how we are and how we walk in the world are interrelated to create the experience that we have. I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of really recent examples that I think do a great job of sort of highlighting the normative already established, taken for granted, and unspoken sort of categories, and what happens when those that are marked as other sort of attempt to make a claim or to address a structural inequality within a system where power has not been evenly distributed and where it's been taken for granted that most people don't have to take an intersectional approach. Most people don't have to examine the aspects of their identity and how it impacts their actual concrete navigation of the world at large. So let's think about the current situation in the United States, just for example, right off the top of my head, kind of. I think if we think about the movement around Black Lives Matters, nobody was talking about how white lives mattered, not until somebody wanted to assert that Black Lives mattered, and that was in response to some really particular events that very clearly marked Black lives as not mattering. Not mattering as much as the lives that are taken to be normative. White, upper class, middle class, the norm being the sort of male, and those who have power. And in that particular social structure, Black lives, just by virtue of the fact that the bodies are black, have less power, are marked as different, are marked as less than. Identity politics figure prominently in that conversation. And so those that were marked already, right, and negatively marked as being other and having less than, less access to resources, less access to privilege, exercising less power, as soon as there's an attempt there to grab onto that identity and actually do something with it really publicly and in response to, not that people haven't been trying to do something with that identity, that's not what I mean to suggest, but I mean in this particular location, right, a call was sort of put out there, people took up the torch, and it really was kind of a very quick movement that Black Lives Matter. This spread like wildfire, especially across social media, and all of a sudden those who'd kind of been without identity, the unnamed, the powerful, the in some ways, like I said, taken for granted and hidden, all of a sudden become part of a movement that says that all lives matter, as though identity hasn't played a factor, hasn't played a role in the rash of shootings and murders of black folks, as though whiteness hasn't played a role in the fact that in these cases, overwhelmingly, people are being murdered for living while black, driving while black, in ways that white people have not experienced, typically. But all of a sudden, there's an attempt by the dominant, the taken for granted, those who hold the identity that is taken as normative, to assert now that all lives matter, so that this is no longer a matter of identity, right? To wash that out, to erase that. And so we see that identity absolutely plays a really profound role, because to suggest that all lives matter in the wake of what has been happening repeatedly, most recently last week, the man who was killed when he called for help when his car broke down, and was shot by law enforcement after just being a motorist with a broken car. As though to suggest that all lives matter equally, when in fact we know quite clearly that is not the case, and it is not playing out as such, is a very real display of power. It's a manifestation of identity politics. It demonstrates quite clearly what happens when those who are marked as other, those who are the containers of cultural and of, that everything that comes along with the being named, because the unnamed, of course, are those who are taken for granted and who have the power and who don't need to be named, much like, white men are often taken to be the norm, let's say in medicine, and anybody who reacts to, let's say, medicine in a different kind of way than what would be the standard is the other. So too is any group that is not the powerful, not the dominant in this particular conversation. And so we see that, in fact, to say that all lives matter is really suggesting that there is a perceived threat in this uprising, in the assertion that Black lives actually do matter. And it's being said because clearly that is not the attitude that is prevalent. And so this is being perceived as a threat from the establishment, if you will, the established identity, those who hold power, a bit of an uprising. And so now there's a scramble to kind of neutralize the threat, to reestablish the power structure. And so we see that identity is both in terms of the rash of killings, but also in terms of who is able to exercise what kind of power in the naming and the saying and the asserting of what does matter and what is important. It's absolutely tied to identity, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about, the influx of refugees in Canada that so many people have been so very resistant to, and we've seen a very real grasping onto identity in terms of Canada and Canadian identity, or in terms of people who are born and raised in the States for generations and generations and generations, but who happen to be Black. So identity politics are a very real and concrete thing, and I think it's very easy in many, many ways to walk through your everyday life and not really have to pay attention to that. I don't think that most people think about identity in a really concrete way. And what's interesting about the example of refugees coming to Canada, and especially when just prior to the election, when the parties were campaigning and Trudeau was saying that he was, going to bring in 25,000 refugees, by Christmas, and that he was really committed to this plan, people were very concerned about what this was going to do to Canadian identity. And these are, quite often these words are spoken by people who couldn't tell you what Canadian identity meant, what it meant to be a Canadian, the sense of sort of a national boundary and a national pride. And a very real and collective forgetting that most of the people engaged in this conversation are also either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. This kind of conversation was not coming from the original peoples or first peoples of this land. Of course, because again, we see how power is operative here, right? And as soon as that which is normative and dominant feels a perceived threat, then there's a reaction. But the first peoples have already been disempowered, disenfranchised, and are also the holders in many ways of what it means to have an identity. Right up until, that same norm, the unspoken, the unnamed, feels a threat, and then there's this grasping onto Canadian identity, what it means to be Canadian, Canadian pride. And it's an attempt to reestablish a particular kind of boundary, to establish, who we are versus who they are, us versus them, and to maintain a particular power structure. And so as you go, those are just a couple of sort of off the top of my head, really concrete examples of how we can see that an intersectional approach to examining how gender figures, how culture and race figure in to a conversation about identity, are really made manifest and kind of hard to ignore once you see them. And they also, both of these examples, I think, really demonstrate just how desperately we need to be taking an intersectional approach to these things, because those things that are taken for granted, those things that so many of us don't have to be conscious of every second of every day as we walk through the world, are not simply a matter of nature. People were not naturally gifted with a particular identity. This is about power, it is about politics. And while within any group, I think as is noted, in some of your reading, there may be some tensions about how to privilege, one aspect of identity over another in order to have some unification on any number of fronts that a group might be fighting, for some power and some legitimacy. While there is that need for unification, I think it is also really important to remain mindful of there is more than one aspect to an identity, and quite often they are interacting all the time to shape every experience that we have, so that in one moment it might be this particular aspect and in this configuration that means that we experience this kind of privilege or lack thereof. And if you shift into another circumstance, then this other aspect of our identity might become dominant, and we might find ourselves needing to align with a different kind of grouping or a different naming of identity, claiming of identity, in order to move that particular set of concerns forward. And so this understanding, this intersectional approach, understands that who we are is made up of a huge variety of factors, and that they interact to shape the experiences that we have and how we operate in our lived lives, is critical to really being able to forge a path forward and to further some of these issues that we have seen play out in our social worlds, like the sort of absolutely blatant murder of Black folks, of Indigenous folks here in Canada. There are peoples who are more at risk just by virtue of who they are, and if that isn't indicative of a need for an intersectional approach to understanding identity, then I don't know what is. So I'm hoping that those couple of examples will help you to have a bit more solid grasp as you go through the lecture and the readings, and can actually sort of apply what you're learning and think, I can see how that is here, see how that is there, because it's everywhere in our social media right now. So it should maybe just help to really solidify your understanding of what these things are about. Now you just have handed in an assignment, so I'm in the business of going through those. I just want to say at the outset, marking online is quite time consuming. It takes me much longer to mark online than it does when I'm marking on paper, so please, I'm asking for you to be patient with me. I'll get through them as quickly as I can and post your grades. If you've had trouble submitting or have questions about submitting or feel like you need an extension, and please just get a hold of me and we will work something out. Automatically, assignments will lock on the due date, I think at 11:59 p.m. on the due date. But if for whatever reason you're having trouble, or you submitted the wrong copy, right, or you forgot to attach a reference page, or there's something, just get a hold of me and we can work it out so that you can add whatever you need to add, or change your submission or whatever it might be. If you have questions about anything else going forward, please get a hold of me. Otherwise, have a great week. I hope that none of you drown. You can probably see the rain on the back of my window here. I'm thinking it's going to be raining for the next few days, so stay warm and dry, and I will see you back here next week. Have a good week. Take care.